Alright, it's finally here, and AMD certainly took their time releasing this one. This is Ryzen 3000 in its final form, the i9-9900KS. And 16 cores and 32 threads is something that I think we really need to take a step back and appreciate. Just a couple of years ago, end users would have probably called you insane for thinking that the Ryzen 3950X could even exist. But there are a few catches. It's not a cheap CPU, it doesn't come with a CPU cooler either, and if the 3900X was anything to go off, the stock is probably going to be very limited. But if you can get your hands on one, the performance here in some areas is pretty much unmatched by any other mainstream desktop CPU. So today we're going to see how the 3950X handles gaming and rendering, and also what you can expect in terms of thermals and overclocking. So the 3950X marks a big shift in the CPU market, where just in the previous generation of Ryzen CPUs, the top core count SKU was the 2700X with half the amount of cores and threads that we're getting with the 3950X. This means that extreme multi-threading performance is no longer reserved for high-end desktop platforms as it was previously, but at the same time this also means that the 3950X pretty much eats second-gen Threadripper alive, specifically the 2950X, and just because this is a mainstream socket CPU does not mean that it will come in at a mainstream price. At $750 it is pretty pricey, although it is $150 less than what the Threadripper 2950X launched at, and the 3950X can slot into much cheaper boards, so it does have that going for it. On Intel's side though, we do have the Cascade Lake X CPUs hitting the shelves soon. The 10940X is at a comparable price point, features 2 less cores and has a higher core clock. Of course though, Cascade Lake X has not launched yet, so no testing with those parts in this review. Now I want to talk about the advertised boost clock of the 3950X, because when the average consumer sees 4.7 GHz, they are definitely expecting to see 4.7 GHz while in use, at the very least be able to overclock to those speeds with aftermarket cooling. Simply put, I never saw 4.7 GHz during testing. In fact, in Cinebench R20 running the single threaded test, the 3950X peaked at just over 4.6 GHz a couple of times. This may be a limitation within the monitoring software, but just something that's definitely worth highlighting. In terms of all 16 core frequencies at load, in Blender with the 3950X running on auto, we're looking at a little under 4 GHz on all 16 cores. Although that is lower than what I've seen on the 12 core 3900X on some boards, it is still a few hundred megahertz higher than the previous gen 2950X Threadripper chip. Bottom line though, you will see some variance here depending on what motherboard you're using. In this case, I was using the MSI X570 Unify, which is certainly no slouch of a board. Now in terms of overclocking, the 3950X sample that I had on hand topped out at 4.4 GHz at a voltage of 1.376 volts. From what we've seen from the other Ryzen 3000 CPUs, the 3950X here is definitely using some of the better binned silicon. There might be a few golden samples that can squeeze close to 4.5 GHz, but my sample was not one of those. At 4.3 GHz, I was stable at just 1.25 volts, 4.2 required 1.18, and then 4.1 GHz, potentially useful to those with limited cooling, was stable at a very mellow 1.15 volts. Again, seeing as the all-core turbo of the 3950X is around 4 GHz flat, all of these frequencies can be considered an all-core overclock. There is going to be some single-threaded performance penalty here though, so just keep that in mind. Thermals are an interesting discussion for the 3950X, as AMD have decided not to bundle this CPU with a compatible cooler. Their formal recommendation here is a 280mm liquid cooler, which will be sufficient for the 3950X's running stock, and also enough headroom for a 4.2 to 4.3 GHz overclock. As we know, CPU thermals heavily depend on the amount of voltage that is being pumped to it, and the variance of vCore between motherboards, as we know, also is pretty wide. For example, some motherboards might provide as much as 1.35 volts under load. In that case, at least a 280mm AIO is recommended, or you could have what we see here, where your motherboard provides just 1.18 volts at load and the 3950X barely heats up at all. For those looking to overclock though, definitely a 360mm is definitely recommended or preferred. You'll also need to make sure that your case has enough airflow. I am looking to do a dedicated video talking about cooling the 3950X also, so do stay tuned for that. As we know, undervolting the chip and just leaving the clock speed at auto is pretty broken, but we might be able to reduce the thermals by some other methods. And a quick look at the VRM thermals here on the X570 Unify, definitely within a safe range. It's going to be a little bit more load than what you'd see from a 3900X. So again, just be sensible with your motherboard choices. Obviously, don't pair a $50 board with a $750 CPU. Choosing something with a solid VRM like the Unify here is definitely recommended. All right, now let's jump right into the benchmarks and let's start with Cinebench R20. And all I can say is I needed to make the graph a little bit wider to fit in the 3950X. Even at stock, it obliterates everything else on the chart and is over 20% faster than the equal core Threadripper 2950X. Overclocking yields a massive 12.3% improvement over stock, breaking the 10,000 point barrier. Looking at single-threaded performance here, the 3950X scores a touch higher than the 3900X, and as I mentioned earlier, overclocking to 4.4 GHz will prevent the 3950X from naturally boosting beyond that, hence why we do get a slight decrease in this test when overclocking. Blender showed some pretty incredible results. Again, the 3950X shows an 18% speed up in render times versus the 2950X, and a 23% boost over the overclocked i9-9900KS when the 3950X is overclocked to 4.4 GHz. So overclocking is definitely worth doing if you're looking for a serious boost in multi-threaded performance. In file compression, again, this is another instance where I needed to stretch the x-axis a little bit on the graph to fit the 3950X. Here it's 18% faster than the 12-core 3900X and 28% faster than the Threadripper 2950X. Decompression proved to be even more impressive. This benchmark seems to be a little bit more core and thread dominant. The results here are simply unmatched by any other mainstream platform CPU. What AMD have managed to squeeze into this tiny package is seriously impressive. Looking at Adobe Premiere performance, specifically the video export benchmark, the 3950X is the first CPU that I've seen to beat the 9900K by a considerable margin. So if you are doing a ton of H.264 encoding, definitely take note here. Alright, but what a lot of you want to know is, can this thing actually game? I mean, AMD are marketing this as both a production workhorse and a high frame rate capable CPU, and the answer to that is yes. Here in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example, we're about on par with Intel's 9700K and 9900K on average, with the lowest 1% of frame rate about 10% behind. On the other hand, we have titles like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which just don't really know what to do with those extra cores and instead prefer raw clock speed. Here, the 3950X is about on par with the R5 3600 and around 15% behind an overclocked 9900KS when clocked to 4.4 GHz. Battlefield 5, on the other hand, is one title that sees a considerable boost over the 3900X, and this means that the 3950X is within a couple percent of the leading overclocked i9. World War Z running the Vulkan API showed again a surprisingly close performance to the i7 and i9 processors, and this is something that I definitely was not expecting. One thing absolutely worth noting here though is that the 3900X in these graphs was not tested with the latest Giza update. I do not have that processor on hand at the moment, and I wouldn't have had enough time to retest it either. Again, I just received the 3950X about 24 hours ago, so that might be a contributing factor to why we're seeing a big performance boost here over the 3900X, as the 3950X was tested with the latest Giza. But then again, we do have those odd titles that just aren't benefiting from those extra cores and threads, and where performance falls a lot more in line with the 3900X. Honestly, this is the performance that you would pretty much expect in most titles. Warhammer Vermintide 2 again showed performance about on par with the 12-core 3900X and about 15% behind the overclocked 9900KS when clocked to 4.4. So another thing I didn't expect was the 4.4 GHz overclock to provide any benefit in gaming, seeing as AMD are quoting a 4.7 GHz boost clock here, but we can see that capping all cores to 4.4 GHz actually does give us a slight boost in performance. We see the same thing in Project Cars 2. The 3950X is about on par with the 3900X in terms of gaming performance, with about a 4% boost on average from overclocking. The most important thing to note though is that the 16-core 3950X can actually game. This was the biggest barrier for most when looking at Threadripper. Sure, for a production system they totally make sense for the price, but gaming performance was very inconsistent amongst various titles. So who is the 3950X even for? I mean, 16 cores is a lot, and be honest, do you really have the workloads that can utilize that many cores and threads? Even myself as a video editor, editing 4K footage, I do not have the workloads that will utilize this CPU to its full potential. The 3950X, in my opinion, is perfect for those who were previously looking towards Threadripper, let's say second generation Threadripper, but were held back because they didn't want to opt into a high-end desktop platform. The biggest benefit of the 3950X is not because of the performance. I mean, the performance numbers speak for themselves, but it's because it can utilize mainstream coolers, go in a mainstream case, and use a mainstream motherboard, most important of all. Solely for gamers, this amount of money is obviously better spent on something like an i9-9900KS or something a bit more mainstream like a Ryzen 3600. $750 is a lot of money for a CPU, but for the workloads that require that level of multi-threading performance, the cost is easily offset by the amount of time saved on your work. To be blunt, if you have to ask yourself if you need the 3950X for your system, then you probably don't need it. But for those who do need it, know that this is what they've been waiting for a very long time. Something that's low power yet still high core count and a lot more build friendly. So if you are interested in the Ryzen 3950X, I will leave some links down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.